A cramped, quiet bathroom became the lonely tomb for Adam Rich's final breath. Instead of the comfort of a warm bed, only the cold floor tiles were there to catch his frail body as he collapsed from a fentanyl overdose, leaving him curled up and alone between four silent walls. In that final moment between life and death, there was no loved one to hold his hand, only a haunting silence to bid farewell to a troubled soul. That was Adam Rich, the boy with the famous bowl cut and mischievous grin from Eight is Enough, who once made the whole country laugh. The cameras that made him a star eventually turned away, leaving him to fight a messy private war with drugs that lasted for decades. Today, let's put aside judgment to look back at Adam's journey, a star who lost his way and remained lonely until the very end. The United States in the mid-1970s was a nation in crisis, its collective psyche bruised by the nightmares of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. The vibrant optimism of the 60s had curdled into deep cynicism, shattering the public's faith in leadership and institutions. It was a time of national exhaustion, where the American dream felt like it was slipping away, leaving a population desperate for stability. Economic stagnation and soaring inflation plagued the era, symbolized by gas lines stretching for blocks and a pervasive sense of malaise. Americans turned away from gritty news, craving proof that the traditional family unit could still survive. Eight is Enough filled this void as necessary emotional comfort food, with Adam Rich serving as a beacon of uncorrupted light in a decade that had lost its way. Adam Rich entered the world on October 12, 1968, in Brooklyn, New York. He was born to Rob and Francine Rich, a young Jewish couple with traditional values and no connection to the glitter of show business. Rob was a mechanic, Francine was a homemaker. They were grounded, working-class people. But Adam's time on the gritty East Coast was fleeting. The siren call of the West Coast was strong in that era, promising sun, space, and economic opportunity. When Adam was a mere 6 months old, the family, soon to be completed by a younger brother named Wayne, packed up their life and moved west. They settled in Granada Hills, a quiet, sun-baked suburban enclave in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. Granada Hills in the 1970s was the epitome of the American suburban dream. It was a place of sprinklers hissing on manicured lawns, ranch-style houses, and children riding bicycles in the street until the streetlights hummed to life. It was a typical upbringing, punctuated only by a brief family sojourn in Florida. It was there, in the Sunshine State, at a local gymnasium of all places, that the trajectory of Adam's life shifted. Adam was an energetic, perhaps even hyperactive child. To burn off some of that boundless energy, his parents enrolled him in acting lessons. It wasn't necessarily with grand ambitions of stardom. It was simply an activity like Little League or Boy Scouts. But it quickly became apparent to his instructors and his parents that Adam possessed something unique. Most children, when placed in front of a camera or an audience, do one of two things. They freeze up in terror, or they perform with exaggerated unnatural mugging. Adam did neither. He had a preternatural naturalism. He possessed an ease in front of a lens that most adult method actors spent a lifetime trying to cultivate. He didn't act like a child, he simply was a child, but one who could take direction and repeat it perfectly. By 1976, the family was back in Los Angeles, and at the tender age of 8, Adam was a working professional. In the cutthroat world of Hollywood auditions, cattle calls where hundreds of mothers push their children forward to be judged on the symmetry of their features, Adam stood out. His face was his fortune. It was cherubic, defined by massive, expressive dark eyes and a mischievous grin that suggested he had a slingshot in his back pocket. He was undeniably cute, but he wasn't plastic. There was a spark of intelligence behind the eyes. He quickly became a staple of commercial television. Before he ever spoke a line in a dramatic series, Adam Rich had already entered millions of living rooms, pushing product. He was the face of McDonald's, convincing other children they needed a Happy Meal. He appeared in adverts for Chevrolet, lending a sense of family wholesomeness to automotive steel. He sold Betty Crocker cakes to busy mothers. In a breathtakingly short order, he clocked up over 25 national commercials. This is a staggering number for a child actor. It meant he was working constantly. He was dependable, he was professional, and he could hit his mark every time. In the industry, he earned a nickname that producers loved, the One-Take Kid. Time was money on a commercial set, and Adam Rich saved the studio money. It was inevitable that this commercial success would translate into narrative television. His first significant foray into drama came in 1976. It was a role that, in retrospect, seems almost too perfectly of its time. He was cast as a character named Bob in a very special episode of The $6 Million Man, titled A Bionic Christmas Carol. Working alongside Lee Majors, the ultimate 70s action hero, Adam wasn't intimidated. He held his own against the Bionic Man. This led to another role in the short-lived 1977 TV movie and subsequent series, The City. He was building a resume brick by brick, proving he was more than just a 30-second salesman. He was a legitimate actor with range. Then came the audition that would define his entire existence. ABC was developing a new dramedy based on the memoirs of newspaper columnist Tom Braden, a real-life man raising 8 children. The show was titled 8 is Enough. The concept was chaotic, loud, and full of heart. But casting the Bradford children was a logistical nightmare. They needed 8 distinctive personalities who looked like they could be related. Specifically, they needed someone to play Nicholas Bradford, the youngest of the brood. The role of Nicholas was critical. In the architecture of a family sitcom, the youngest child serves a specific function. They are the Greek chorus of innocence. They are the emotional anchor, the one whose problem seems smallest to the audience, but whose reactions feel the biggest. The producers needed a child who could be precocious without being annoying, someone who could cry on cue, but also deliver a punchline with impeccable timing. Hundreds of boys were seen. None felt right. When Adam walked into the audition room, the producers knew almost instantly. He was wearing a little blazer, his hair already falling into that natural bowl shape. He read the lines with a spunky, slightly cheeky attitude that was irresistible. He didn't just look the part. He embodied the specific energy they were desperately searching for. He was small for his age, which made him appear even more vulnerable, yet he had a gravelly, distinct voice that made him sound like a little old man. The contrast was comedy gold. 8 is Enough premiered in March 1977 as a mid-season replacement, and it was an immediate sensation. It was exactly the tonic the public needed. The pilot introduced the Bradford clan to America, but tragically, the show was touched by death before it even truly began. Diana Hyland, the actress who played the mother Joan Bradford, became ill with breast cancer during the filming of the first few episodes. She died in March 1977, just as the show was debuting. This real-life tragedy forced the show to pivot. 8 is Enough became a show about a widower trying to raise 8 kids alone. This injected a layer of genuine pathos and sadness into the sitcom format. It grounded the show in reality. And amidst this large ensemble cast, including established theater actors and teenage heartthrobs like Grant Goodeve and Willie Ames, it was the littlest Bradford who stole the show every single week. Adam Rich wasn't just a part of the cast. He became the mascot of the series. The writers quickly realized that if they gave Nicholas a storyline, the ratings held steady. If Nicholas was sad, America was sad. If Nicholas was in trouble, America worried. It is hard to overstate the level of fame Adam Rich achieved between 1977 and 1978. He was quite simply the most famous child in America. He was on lunchboxes, T-shirts, and the covers of Tiger Beat and Teen Beat, even though he was far from a teen. He received sackfuls of fan mail, much of it from mothers who wished their own sons were just a little bit more like Nicholas Bradford. He was paraded on talk shows, sitting in oversized chairs next to Johnny Carson and Mike Douglas, his little legs dangling off the edge, charming the audience with his precocious anecdotes. But behind the scenes, a crucial relationship was forming that would anchor Adam's life for decades. The on-screen chemistry with the patriarch of the Bradford clan, played by the veteran character actor Dick Van Patten, was potent. This relationship is crucial to understanding Adam's life. On screen, they shared tender moments of fatherly advice and youthful misunderstanding. Off screen, the dynamic was profoundly deeper. Dick Van Patten was a legend of the stage and screen, a kind, generous man, an old-school professional who took the young cast under his wing. But with Adam it was different. Van Patten, a father himself, saw a vulnerability in Adam that tugged at his heartstrings. Adam, thrust into this high-pressure adult world, looked to Van Patten not just as a mentor, but as a surrogate father figure. While Adam's biological father, Rob, was present and managing his career, the hours Adam spent on set meant that Van Patten became the dominant male figure in his daily life. Adam later recalled that during the filming seasons, he spent more waking hours on the set with Dick than he did with his own family. Van Patten treated Adam like his own son, providing a stabilizing influence in the chaotic whirlwind of production schedules, publicity tours, and sudden fame. They would play games between takes. Van Patten would teach him about betting on horse racing, and they would share lunches. This bond was immense, beautiful, and in later years complicated, as Adam struggled to live up to the wholesome image his television father so effortlessly projected. As the late 70s rolled on, Adam Rich was on top of the world. He was making good money, he was beloved by millions, and he was the star of a top 10 show. But the seeds of future trouble were being sown in the soil of this immense success. He was a child living an adult's life, celebrated for being cute, while internally he was beginning to grow up. Even as his mind was expanding and the pressures of fame began to tighten their grip, the little brother was about to face the complexities of a world that wouldn't let him grow up. Yet this immense adoration came with a hidden cost that no contract could quantify. While the world saw a charmed life of limitless opportunity, the reality inside the studio walls was becoming increasingly claustrophobic. The transition from a child enjoying a hobby to a cornerstone of a major network franchise was subtle but absolute. As the 1970s drew to a close, Adam was no longer just a boy playing dress-up. He was a commodity. By 1979, the machinery of 8 is Enough was running at maximum efficiency. To the outside observer, Adam Rich was living a fairy tale. He was the prince of the ABC network, earning a salary that dwarfed the income of his own parents and living a life of limousines, award shows, and adoring crowds. But if you peeled back the layer of glossy magazine covers, the reality was far more industrial. Adam wasn't just a child, he was a corporate asset. He was a vital component in a multi-million-dollar engine, and like any component, he was expected to perform with mechanical reliability. The daily existence of a child star in the late 70s was a grueling paradox. By law, Adam was required to attend school, but his classroom was a trailer on a soundstage, isolated from his peers, tutored in 3-hour blocks squeezed between scene setups. The rest of his day was dictated by the assistant director's bullhorn. While other 10-year-olds were scraping their knees playing kickball or learning the social hierarchy of the playground, Adam was learning hitting marks, finding his key light, and memorizing pages of dialogue. He was surrounded almost exclusively by adults, makeup artists, lighting grips, producers, and directors. This isolation created a strange psychological bifurcation. On set, Adam was treated as a peer by the adults. He was a coworker. He heard their jokes, he saw their stress, and he absorbed their behaviors. He was expected to have the discipline of a 40-year-old union worker. Yet, the moment the director yelled "cut," the dynamic shifted violently. He was suddenly the kid again, patted on the head, handed a juice box, and told to go to his trailer. This constant toggling between adult responsibility and infantilized celebrity created a confused sense of self. Who was he? Was he the professional actor carrying a scene, or was he the little boy who needed a chaperone to go to the bathroom? The most visible symbol of this entrapment was, of course, the hair. As the 70s bled into the early 80s, fashion was changing. The soft, feathered looks of the disco era were giving way to sharper, more modern styles. Adam, entering his preteen years, desperately wanted to change his look. He wanted to cut his hair. He wanted to look like a regular kid, perhaps a bit tougher, a bit cooler. But the producers of 8 is Enough were adamant, absolutely not. The Nicholas Bradford bowl cut was a trademark. It was on the dolls. It was on the lunchboxes. To cut his hair would be to damage the brand. So Adam was forced to maintain a hairstyle that he increasingly resented. It locked him visually into a state of perpetual innocence. Even as his voice began to crack and his body began to change, the hair remained the same. It was a golden cage. He was growing up, but his public image was frozen in amber. He was forced to perform a version of himself that he was rapidly outgrowing, a pantomime of childhood that felt increasingly fraudulent. It was in this pressure cooker that the first cracks began to appear. The origin of Adam's demons was not a sudden trauma, but a slow, quiet accumulation of coping mechanisms. By his own admission in later years, Adam began drinking alcohol at the age of 11. This is a shocking statistic, but in the context of his environment, it has a tragic logic. Adam spent his life at industry parties, rap parties, and promotional events. He was a child in a room full of adults who were drinking to unwind after a 14-hour day. He wanted to belong. He didn't want to be the kid in the corner. He wanted to be one of the guys. He saw alcohol as the social lubricant that dissolved the barrier between him and the adults he admired. It started small, a sip here, a sneak there. But for Adam, alcohol did something more than just make him feel grown up. It quieted the noise. It took the edge off the anxiety of performance. It numbed the pressure of being America's little brother. While Nicholas Bradford was on screen drinking milk and learning moral lessons about honesty, Adam Rich was off screen, at age 12, learning that a stiff drink made the world feel softer. It was a secret life, hidden behind the bright studio lights. The public saw the cherub. They didn't see the boy pouring a drink to cope with the exhaustion of being a national icon. In 1980, the cracks in the show's foundation also began to show. The scripts were becoming repetitive. The older actors were looking to move on. The ratings, while still respectable, were slipping from their stratospheric heights. The television landscape was shifting again. The gentle family dramedy was starting to feel old-fashioned, compared to the grittier fare beginning to emerge. Then, in 1981, the axe fell. 8 is Enough was canceled after 5 seasons. For the viewing public, it was just the end of a show. For Adam Rich, it was the end of his world. The cancellation of a long-running series is a traumatic event for any actor, but for a child who has spent his entire formative life on that set, it is cataclysmic. For 5 years, the cast and crew had been his family. The set had been his home. Dick Van Patten had been his daily father figure. Suddenly, the lights were turned off. The sets were struck and thrown into dumpsters. The family dispersed to look for other work. The routine that had structured every minute of Adam's life vanished overnight. Adam was 12 years old. He was unemployed for the first time in memory, and he was facing a terrifying reality. He was entering the awkward years. In Hollywood casting terms, a 12 to 13-year-old boy is a liability. He is no longer the cute, precocious child who can sit on a lap, but he is not yet the teenage heartthrob who can play the romantic lead. He is in limbo. He is changing physically, acne, voice breaks, growth spurts. He is uncastable. The phone, which had rung incessantly since he was 8, suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. The entourage of agents and managers who had fawned over him began to drift away, looking for the next cute kid. This is the moment the curse truly begins, not with drugs or arrests, but with the crushing realization that your value as a human being is tied entirely to your utility as a product. When the product is no longer in demand, the person is discarded. Adam, however, was a fighter. He wasn't ready to fade away. He and his team pushed for a pivot. They needed to shatter the image of Nicholas Bradford. They needed a role that was tougher, grittier, more masculine. They found what they thought was the answer in the legendary producer Irwin Allen. Irwin Allen was the master of disaster, the man behind the Poseidon Adventure and the Towering Inferno. He was developing a new action drama series called Code Red. The premise was high concept, a multi-generational family of firefighters in Los Angeles. It was meant to be exciting, full of explosions, rescues, and sirens. Adam was cast as Danny Blake, a young boy adopted by the fire chief, who is obsessed with the fire department. On paper, it looked like a smart move. It kept Adam on screen, but placed him in an action setting. He traded the bowl cut for a slightly more mature look. He wore a fire department uniform. He was running into burning buildings. It was an attempt to age him up, to show the audience that he was a young man of action, not just a cute face. Code Red premiered in 1981, carrying high hopes. But the magic wasn't there. The scripts were clunky, the action was repetitive, and the premise felt forced. Audiences weren't ready to see Nicholas Bradford fighting fires. They couldn't reconcile the boy they loved with this new, serious character. The show struggled to find an audience. It was expensive to produce and low in ratings, a death sentence in network television. The show was canceled after just one short season in 1982. This failure hurt more than the end of 8 is enough. The first cancellation could be blamed on the show simply running its course. The failure of Code Red felt personal. It was a rejection of Adam Rich, the actor. It confirmed his worst fear, that the public only wanted him as Nicholas Bradford, and Nicholas Bradford no longer existed. By 1982, Adam was 14. The failure of Code Red left him adrift in the vast sprawl of Los Angeles. He was a teenager with too much money, too much free time, and no structure. The discipline of the set was gone, but the desire for the adrenaline rush of performance remained. Lacking a creative outlet, he began to seek that rush elsewhere. The drinking, which had been a social crutch, began to darken into a necessity. And in the haze of 1982 Los Angeles, marijuana was ubiquitous. Adam graduated from alcohol to cannabis. It wasn't just about partying. It was about numbing the sting of rejection. It was about filling the void where the applause used to be. The one-take kid was becoming the troubled teen, though the public didn't know it yet. He found some solace in a place where his face didn't matter, the recording booth. In 1983, he landed a role in the Saturday morning cartoon Dungeons and Dragons. He voiced Presto the Magician, a bumbling but well-meaning wizard. It was a popular show and it provided a steady paycheck. For a few hours a week, Adam could disappear into a character. He didn't have to worry about his height, his acne, or his haircut. He could just be a voice. But voice work, while respectable, lacks the visibility of live-action stardom. It didn't feed the ego in the way primetime television did. It didn't get him on magazine covers. To the world at large, Adam Rich had vanished. The questions started coming from strangers on the street. Hey, didn't you used to be that kid? What happened to you? Why aren't you on TV anymore? These questions are daggers to a former child star. They reinforce the narrative of failure. They remind the individual that their best days are essentially behind them at the age of 14. Adam began to retreat. He stopped trying to be the good boy. If the world was going to treat him like a has-been, he might as well act out. The transition from 1983 to 1985 was a slide into the abyss. He dropped out of the public eye almost entirely, surfacing only for guest spots on shows like The Love Boat or Fantasy Island. In these roles, he was often cast as the troubled kid or a slight variation of his old persona. It was humiliating work, serving as a reminder of his diminished status. He was no longer the star. He was the special guest, a novelty act to boost ratings for a week. Behind the scenes, the substance use was escalating. The marijuana and alcohol were no longer enough to quell the growing depression and the physical pain of growing pains and minor injuries. He was entering the darkest phase of 1980s Hollywood excess, a time when cocaine and harder drugs were flooding the parties of the Sunset Strip. The innocent boy from the suburbs was walking directly into the fire, and this time there was no scriptwriter to ensure a happy ending. The buffer of his television family was gone, and his real family, loving as they were, was ill-equipped to handle the tsunami of addiction that was about to crash down on their son. This loss of professional purpose left a dangerous vacuum in Adam's life, just as he was entering his most vulnerable years. Without the strict regimen of the set to hold him together, the structure of his days collapsed, leaving him exposed to the darker currents of Hollywood's underbelly. The innocent suburban streets of Granada Hills could no longer contain a young man who had tasted stardom and was now starving for significance. As he drifted away from the camera, he began to drift toward a new crowd, one that didn't care about ratings or reviews but offered a far more immediate and destructive form of escape. The mid-1980s in Los Angeles were a time of neon-soaked excess. The city was awash in a culture of conspicuous consumption, hair metal, and a laissez-faire attitude towards vice that bordered on the nihilistic. For a teenager with a famous face, a pocket full of residuals, and no job to go to in the morning, the city was not a home. It was a playground designed to destroy him. By 1986, Adam Rich was 17 years old. In the eyes of the state, he was a minor. In the eyes of the entertainment industry, he was a retiree. And in his own eyes, he was an outcast. He was enrolled at Chatsworth High School, a veritable factory for celebrity offspring and child stars in the San Fernando Valley. It was a place where seeing a face from television in the cafeteria was commonplace. Yet, Adam felt a profound disconnect from his peers. School is a social hierarchy based on the present. Who is cool now? Who is dating whom now? Adam's currency was based on the past. He was that kid from that show that got canceled. To the other students, he was a relic of their own childhoods, a living reminder of a time they were trying to outgrow. The bullying was subtle but pervasive. The whispers, the stares, the assumption that he was stuck up or rich beyond measure. The academic structure felt pointless to him. He had spent his formative years being told he was special, that he had a career. Now he was being asked to care about algebra and history when he had already lived a life that most adults only dreamed of. He had traveled, he had signed autographs, he had bank accounts managed by accountants. The cognitive dissonance was too great. In 1986, Adam made the decision that would sever his last tether to a normal life. He dropped out of high school. It was a gesture of defiance. It was Adam telling the world that he didn't need their systems, their diplomas, or their approval. He was Adam Rich. He was a star. But beneath the bravado, it was a retreat. He was fleeing an environment where he felt judged and inadequate, unmoored from education and employment. Adam drifted into the Hollywood party scene. But he didn't enter the A-list parties of the current stars, the Rob Lowe's or the Tom Cruises. He drifted into the subculture of the former stars. There is a specific tragic social circle in Hollywood comprised of people who used to be famous. They gather to reminisce, to validate each other's past glories, and, all too often, to commiserate over their present irrelevance. In this circle, drugs were not just recreational, they were a bonding ritual. They were the equalizer. Cocaine was the fuel of the 80s, a drug that provided a burst of artificial confidence, a manic energy that mimicked the rush of performing. For Adam, who was dealing with the crushing lethargy of depression and the silence of a phone that didn't ring, cocaine was a way to feel alive again. It made him feel like the center of attention. It made him feel like Nicholas Bradford again, charming, quick-witted, and beloved. But the highs were followed by crushing lows. The come down was a brutal reminder of his reality. To combat the jitters and the paranoia of the stimulants, he turned to downers, alcohol, marijuana, and eventually prescription pills. It was a chemical roller coaster. Uppers to start the night, downers to end it. His body became a chemistry set. The tabloids, which had once printed glowing stories about his favorite ice cream flavor, now began to sharpen their knives. The National Enquirer and the Star smelled blood. There is a perverse industry in tearing down child stars. It sells papers to show that America's sweetheart is actually a mess. Every stumble, every bleary-eyed exit from a club was documented. Adam was no longer America's little brother. He was becoming a wild child. The darkness reached a terrifying crescendo in 1989. Adam was 21 years old, the age he should have been graduating from college or starting a serious adult career. Instead, he was living in a haze of substance abuse that had spiraled out of control. On a warm night in April, the silence of the Rich family home was shattered by the sound of sirens. Adam had collapsed. He had ingested a massive toxic cocktail of prescription drugs. This was not a recreational slip-up. The volume of pills suggested a profound disregard for whether he woke up the next morning. He was rushed to the Humana Hospital in West Hills, his body limp, his breathing shallow. For days, Adam Rich lay in a coma. The machines breathed for him. The boy with the bowl cut was hovering in the gray space between life and death. The news broke nationally. Nicholas Bradford in coma. 8 is enough star fights for life. The headlines were screaming, hysterical. Outside the hospital, the media circus assembled. Vans with satellite dishes, reporters with microphones, photographers with telephoto lenses. They all camped out, waiting for the update. Was he going to die? It was a grotesque vigil. The public was shocked. To them, Nicholas Bradford was still 8 years old. How could he be dying of an overdose? It shattered the illusion of the sitcom perfection. It forced the audience to realize that while they were watching reruns, the real boy had been suffering. Miraculously, Adam survived. He woke up. But he didn't wake up to a new life. He woke up to the same one, only now he was physically weaker and publicly branded as a junkie. The survival of an overdose is often narrativized in movies as a wake-up call, a moment of clarity where the protagonist flushes the drugs and turns their life around. Real life is rarely so linear. For Adam, the overdose was a source of shame, but it didn't solve the underlying pain. He was discharged from the hospital, but the demons were waiting for him in the parking lot. He had physical pain now, too. The years of reckless living, minor accidents, and the general wear and tear of a body under stress had left him with chronic aches. It is here that a specific physical element enters the tragedy. Adam began to suffer from severe shoulder problems. The joint was unstable. It would slip out of place, causing blinding white-hot agony. In a cruel twist of fate, the treatment for this pain was the very thing Adam was least equipped to handle: opiates. Doctors prescribed painkillers. For an addict, a legitimate prescription is the ultimate Trojan horse. It is medicine, sanctioned by a professional, yet it feeds the beast of addiction just as surely as a street drug. Adam found that the painkillers didn't just stop the shoulder from hurting. They stopped the life from hurting. They provided a warm, fuzzy blanket of dissociation. As the 80s ended and the 90s began, the medical community was becoming more aware of drug-seeking behavior. Doctors began to cut him off. They looked at his chart, saw the history of the overdose, saw the admissions for substance abuse, and they said no. This rejection by the medical establishment pushed Adam into a corner. He was in genuine physical pain. His shoulder was a wreck, and he was in the throes of addiction withdrawal. A desperate mind is capable of terrifying logic. If the doctors wouldn't give him the medicine for the pain he had, he would create a pain so undeniable that they would have no choice. In a sequence of events that reads like a horror story, Adam began to deliberately dislocate his own shoulder. He would slam it against walls, wrench it out of the socket, inflicting torture upon himself. He would then go to the emergency room, sweating and pale, with a visibly dislocated limb. The doctors, seeing the injury, would have to treat him. They would have to administer morphine. He did this, by some accounts, 12 times. It was a cycle of self-mutilation for relief. It was the act of a man who was trapped in a physical and psychological prison. He was destroying his body to feed his brain. The cute kid was gone. In his place was a man taking a sledgehammer to his own anatomy just to get through the day. The innocence of the 70s was a distant memory. The one-take kid was now a frequent flyer in the ERs of the San Fernando Valley, and the world was about to see just how desperate he had become. The incident that would define his public image for the next decade was looming on the horizon. If the 1980s were a slow slide into obscurity for Adam Rich, the dawn of the 1990s was a violent collision with rock bottom. The little brother of America was about to become a headline on the police blotter. The date was April 6, 1991. The location was West Hills, a quiet, affluent suburb in the San Fernando Valley, not far from where Adam had grown up. It was the kind of neighborhood where crimes were supposed to be limited to jaywalking or a noise complaint about a barking dog. It was not the place for a violent felony. It was 4 a.m. The streets were empty, bathed in the sickly orange glow of sodium streetlights. A car pulled up to a medical building on Fallbrook Avenue. Inside was Adam Rich, now 22 years old. He was sweating, agitated, and driven by a singular consuming compulsion. Adam wasn't looking for cash. He wasn't looking to rob a vault. He wanted the drugs. In his hand, he gripped a heavy, rusted tire iron. He approached the glass doors of the pharmacy. In a moment that shattered the last vestiges of his childhood image, he swung the iron. The sound of smashing safety glass is incredibly loud in the silence of the suburbs, a chaotic, jarring crash that signaled the end of Adam's private struggle and the beginning of his public shame. He stepped through the jagged shards, intent on finding the safe where the opiates were stored. But the noise had alerted a nearby security guard and police patrol. The response was swift. There was no Hollywood chase scene, no dramatic standoff. Adam was arrested on the spot. He was handcuffed, read his rights, and shoved into the back of a squad car. The booking photo, the mugshot, is a cruel genre of photography. It strips away all artifice. When Adam's mugshot was released to the press, it was a shock to the system of the American public. The cherubic face was puffy and unshaven. The bright, mischievous eyes of Nicholas Bradford were deadened, glazed over with a mixture of intoxication and profound exhaustion. He looked lost. He was charged with burglary, a felony that carried significant jail time. The media vultures descended. But this time, the reaction wasn't shock. It was a dark form of validation. The nice kid hadn't just gone bad. He had fulfilled the prophecy. The tabloids gleefully framed it as the latest chapter in the Curse of the Child Star narrative, placing Adam alongside figures like Dana Plato and Todd Bridges. They weren't just reporting news, they were characterizing a fall from grace. They camped outside the Van Nuys jail, expecting a lawyer in a sharp suit or a distraught mother to appear. What happened next is one of the most poignant moments in the history of Hollywood friendships. The man who walked into the police station to post Adam's bail wasn't a PR fix-it man. It was Dick Van Patten. Dick Van Patten was the definition of Hollywood royalty, not in the sense of arrogance, but in terms of dignity. He was a man of the theater, a man of family, and a man of immense kindness. He had watched Adam grow up. He had seen the bright spark in the 8-year-old boy, and he had watched the light dim in the teenager. When he heard the news, he didn't call his publicist to ask if it would be bad for his brand to be associated with a felon. He simply got in his car. When Van Patten arrived, he didn't lecture Adam. He didn't perform for the cameras. He posted the bail money, thousands of dollars, quietly and efficiently. When asked by reporters why he was there, his answer was simple and devastatingly human. I love him like a son. This wasn't just a soundbite. In an industry defined by transactional relationships, where friendship usually means, what can you do for me right now? Van Patten's loyalty was an anomaly. He recognized that Adam's crime wasn't an act of malice. It was a symptom of a disease. He saw the pain behind the tire iron. This act of grace likely saved Adam's life. It reminded Adam that he was lovable not just as a star, but as a flawed, broken human being. It provided a flicker of hope in the absolute darkness of his humiliation. The legal proceedings were humiliating. Adam pleaded no contest to the charges. The judge, recognizing that prison would likely destroy a young man of Adam's fragility and profile, showed mercy. He was sentenced to a drug rehabilitation program. This marked the beginning of the rehab years. Throughout the early and mid-90s, Adam rotated through various treatment centers. He became a resident of the recovery industry. It was a grueling process. Rehab is not a spa. It is a place where you are forced to confront the wreckage of your psyche without the buffer of chemicals. For Adam, this meant stripping away the actor persona and finding the person underneath. It meant dealing with the trauma of early fame, the loss of identity, and the chronic physical pain of his shoulder. He had periods of sobriety, months where the light would return to his eyes. But addiction is a cunning adversary. Relapses happened. The tabloids would gleefully report every stumble. Adam Rich caught using again. He was living his recovery in a fishbowl. Every time he bought a beer, it was news. Every time he looked tired in public, it was speculation. In 1996, in an attempt to regain control over this suffocating narrative, Adam made a decision that was equal parts brilliant and disastrous. He teamed up with Might Magazine, a satirical publication based in San Francisco, edited by a young Dave Eggers, who would later become a literary titan with a heartbreaking work of staggering genius. The concept was postmodern and risky. They would fake Adam Rich's death. The idea was to publish a serious-looking article claiming that Adam Rich had been murdered in a mugging gone wrong outside a club in Los Angeles. The article would be a tribute, but the subtext was a biting satire of the media's obsession with celebrity tragedy. They wanted to expose the grief industry, how the media only cared about child stars when they were dead or in handcuffs. They wanted to show how superficial the public mourning was. Adam was fully on board. He gave them permission. He even participated in the planning. For him, it was a way to kill Nicholas Bradford once and for all. It was a way to say, "You want a tragedy? Here, I'll give you one. Now leave me alone." When the issue of Might hit the stands, the reaction was immediate. But it wasn't the intellectual appreciation of satire they had hoped for. It was confusion and horror. The pre-internet world meant that fact-checking was slow. Newswires picked up the headline, "Adam Rich dead at 27. Fans were devastated. Tributes began to flow. When the truth came out that Adam was alive and well and that it was all a prank, the backlash was ferocious. The media felt duped. The fans felt betrayed. Adam was branded as callous, desperate for attention, and sick. The satire flew over the heads of the general public. Instead of looking like a clever social critic, Adam looked like a washed-up actor pulling a publicity stunt to get his name back in the papers. The incident backfired spectacularly. It deepened his isolation. It made him a pariah in the industry. Casting directors who were already wary of his drug history now saw him as a liability and a loose cannon. The death hoax became another stain on his reputation, overshadowing the valid point he was trying to make. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of the scandal, something shifted in Adam. The stunt, failed as it was, had been an act of agency. He had stopped being a passive victim of the press and had tried to play the game. The failure forced him to look inward. He realized that he couldn't control the media, and he couldn't control the public's perception. He could only control himself. As the 90s drew to a close, Adam began to drift away from the idea of a comeback. The desperate need to be on camera began to fade, replaced by a need for something more sustainable: peace. He began to accept that Nicholas Bradford was a ghost. He was Adam Rich, a man in his 30s with a bad shoulder, a history of addiction, and a lot of life left to live. The arc of his life was bending away from the spotlight and towards the shadows, not the shadows of shame, but the shadows of privacy. He was beginning the long, hard work of becoming a civilian, but the demons were not gone. They were merely sleeping. And the world he was entering, the 21st century, would bring new challenges, new drugs, and a new, more ruthless form of media connectivity that would test his fragile sobriety to the breaking point. However, the turn of the millennium offered no respite from the ghosts of the past. Instead, it brought a new era of harsh reality that forced Adam to confront his mortality without the shield of irony. The media circus of the 1990s had faded, but it left behind a man who was weary of performing his own tragedy for an audience. As the culture shifted away from the wholesome family values of his youth toward a sharper, more cynical digital age, Adam found himself facing a profound personal reckoning that would strip away the last of his defenses and force him to decide if he wanted to be a punchline or a survivor. The era of the three-network dominance was over. The innocent family sitcom had been replaced by the cynicism of Seinfeld and the voyeurism of reality television. The world of 8 is Enough felt like an artifact from a different geological epoch. For Adam Rich, now entering his 30s, this shift was both a blessing and a curse. It meant he was no longer the center of attention, but it also meant he was left to navigate the wreckage of his past without a map. The early 2000s brought a dark reinforcement to the media's favorite narrative about the 8 is Enough cast. For years, whispers of a Bradford curse had circulated in the tabloids, a sensationalist shorthand used to group the struggles of the various cast members. In 2001, those whispers turned into a scream. Lainey O'Grady, who had played the intelligent, high-strung sister, Mary Bradford, was found dead in her mobile home in Santa Clarita. The cause was toxic intoxication, a lethal mix of Vicodin and Prozac. Lanny's death was a sledgehammer blow to Adam. Lanny had been his on-screen sister, but off-screen, she was his mirror. She too had suffered from crippling anxiety. She too had turned to pharmaceuticals to quiet the noise in her head. They were the two broken birds of the Bradford clan. Losing her wasn't just losing a friend, it was a terrifying glimpse into his own potential future. It was a stark reminder that the curse wasn't a supernatural force, but a very real, biological and psychological susceptibility to addiction that they both shared. The media coverage of Lanny's death was predictably lurid, dragging Adam's name back into the spotlight as the other troubled one. But Adam refused to let the tragedy send him into a tailspin. Instead, he retreated further into a private life, trying to find a stability that had eluded him for 2 decades. He was tired. The anger of the death hoax era had burned off, leaving behind a weary resolve. In 2003, Adam resurfaced in a way that surprised the industry. He accepted a role in the David Spade comedy Dickie Roberts, former child star. The film was a ruthless, often cruel satire of the very ecosystem Adam had survived. It depicted child stars as washed-up, desperate grotesques living in a halfway house, playing poker and trading war stories of their glory days. Adam agreed to appear as himself. In a scene featuring a poker game with other real-life former child stars like Corey Feldman and Dustin Diamond, Adam is seen laughing, joking, and playing along with the caricature. To the casual viewer, it was just a funny cameo. But to those who knew Adam's history, it was a profound act of reclaiming power. By being in on the joke, Adam defanged it. He was essentially saying, "I know who I am. I know what you think of me, and I can laugh at it." It showed a lack of ego and a self-awareness that was disarming. He wasn't a victim of the industry anymore. He was a survivor observing it. However, the laughter on screen hid a persistent, grinding battle off screen. While the drug addiction was the headline, the root cause was far more insidious. Adam suffered from what doctors call treatment-resistant depression. This is not merely sadness. It is a physiological crushing of the spirit. It is a chemical imbalance that refuses to correct itself, regardless of the medication thrown at it. For the next decade, Adam's life was a series of skirmishes in a war against his own brain. He tried everything. He went through experimental treatments. He rotated through different therapists. He spent time in and out of rehabilitation centers, not always for drugs, but sometimes just to find a safe harbor where he wouldn't hurt himself. The rise of social media in the 2000s gave Adam a new voice. On platforms like Twitter, he found he could communicate directly with the world, bypassing the tabloids that had tormented him for 30 years. He didn't use social media to chase fame or promote a comeback. He used it to be human. His online presence was remarkably candid. He didn't curate a perfect life. He tweeted about his insomnia. He tweeted about his depression. He tweeted about the struggle to stay sober. He engaged with fans not as Nicholas Bradford, but as Adam, a guy who liked sports, hated injustice, and was trying to get through the day. He became an accidental advocate. People suffering from mental illness saw themselves in his tweets. They saw a man who had everything, lost it, and was still waking up every morning to fight. His publicist and friend, Danny Deraney, would later describe Adam during this period not as a tragedy, but as a warrior. It is an apt descriptor. To wake up every day with a brain that tells you to give up and to choose to live anyway is an act of valor. Adam was fighting a battle in a bunker that no one else could see. There were victories. The most significant came in the mid-2000s when he committed to a rigorous program of sobriety. He stopped the maintenance drinking. He cut out the hard drugs. He began to attend meetings with the dedication he had once applied to learning lines. In October 2022, Adam posted a tweet that would become his final public victory lap. He announced that he had achieved 7 years of sobriety. 7 years. That is 2,555 days of saying no. It was a monumental achievement for a man who had started drinking at age 11. The tweet was joyful, hopeful, and proud. It signaled that he had finally found a way to live in the world without numbing himself to it. He was clear-eyed. He was making plans. He was working on a memoir, writing down his story in his own words, determined to correct the record before he died. But the physical toll of the past was inescapable. The body keeps the score. The decades of substance abuse, the smoking, the stress, and the poor health habits of a bachelor living alone had weakened him. He wasn't the energetic boy anymore. He was a middle-aged man with a fragile system. He lived a quiet life in Brentwood, Los Angeles. It was a modest existence. He wasn't rich in the financial sense. The money from 8 is Enough was long gone, swallowed by taxes, agents, and addiction. But he was rich in friends. He had a tight circle who checked on him. He was a beloved figure in his neighborhood, the guy who would stop to talk to anyone, the guy who never acted like a celebrity. As 2022 drew to a close, Adam seemed to be in a good place. He was sober. He was writing. He was reconciled with his past. He had made peace with the ghost of Nicholas Bradford. He was no longer running. He was standing still, finally comfortable in his own skin. But the tragedy of addiction is that it leaves landmines in your path long after the war is over. The treatment-resistant depression and the chronic anxiety were still there, lurking. And in a moment of weakness, or perhaps a moment of accidental miscalculation in the search for relief from physical pain or anxiety, the old enemy found a way back in. The context of the opioid crisis in America is vital here. In the 2020s, the drug supply had become poisoned. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin, was infiltrating everything. It was in pills sold as Xanax. It was in powders sold as cocaine. It was an invisible killer, turning a minor lapse in judgment into a death sentence. Adam Rich had spent his life surviving the sharks of Hollywood, the vultures of the press, and the demons of his own mind. He had survived the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. He had survived an overdose in 1989. He had survived the loss of his TV family. He had built a fortress of sobriety. But as 2023 dawned, the fortress was breached by a microscopic enemy. This solitary battle against the invisible chemistry of the modern drug supply would prove to be the final chapter in a life defined by public resilience and private suffering. Despite the years of hard-won sobriety and the genuine hope he had cultivated, the margin for error had vanished. In the end, the warrior who had survived the excesses of the Viper Room era and the brutality of the tabloids was not defeated by a lifestyle of glamour, but by a quiet, accidental tragedy that unfolded behind closed doors. The weekend of January 7th, 2023 was quiet in Los Angeles. The frantic energy of the holiday season had dissipated, replaced by the gray, damp calm of early January. In the modest home in the Brentwood section of the city where Adam Rich lived, the silence was absolute. There were no cameras, no directors, no audience. The man who had lived his entire life in the public eye died in total privacy. It was a friend who found him. Concerned by a lack of response unusual for Adam, who was known for his digital connectivity, they entered the residence. They found Adam lifeless. He was 54 years old. The arrival of the paramedics was a formality. There was no rush to the hospital, no sirens screaming in the night as there had been in 1989. The scene was declared a dead body investigation. The police cordon tape that fluttered in the breeze was the only signal to the neighbors that the boy who had once been America's son was gone. News travels at the speed of light in the digital age. Within hours, the headlines were populating the screens of millions of smartphones. Adam Rich, dead at 54. For a generation of people now in their 50s and 60s, the news hit with a specific dull ache. It wasn't the shock of a young star dying. It was the melancholy of realizing that the symbol of their own childhood innocence had finally succumbed to the darkness he had fought for so long. When the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner finally released the report months later, it confirmed what many had feared, but with a tragic twist. It wasn't a deliberate act of self-destruction, but an accident. The cause of death was confirmed as effects of fentanyl. The toxicology report painted a picture not of a wild bender, but of a man trying to manage his internal state. There were non-toxic levels of alcohol. There were traces of generic anti-anxiety medication. But the lethal agent was fentanyl. It is highly probable that Adam did not know he was taking it. In the treacherous landscape of the modern illicit drug supply, fentanyl is a contaminant, a ghost in the machine. A man who had survived the heroin and cocaine excesses of the 1980s was ultimately felled by a synthetic poison that didn't exist when he was a star. It was a slip, a moment of vulnerability that turned fatal because of the unforgiving potency of the drug. The reaction from his 8 is Enough family was immediate and heart-wrenching. They were the only ones who truly understood the unique pressure cooker he had lived in. They didn't speak of a washed-up child star. They spoke of a brother, Betty Buckley. The Broadway legend who had played his stepmother, Abby, wrote a tribute that cut through the noise. She called him a light. She described a man who, despite his pain, always tried to bring joy to the set. She dismantled the tabloid image of the troubled teen and replaced it with the memory of a sweet, intelligent boy who just wanted to be loved. But it was Willie Ames, the actor who played his brother Tommy, whose grief was most palpable. Ames had been Adam's partner in crime, his protector, and his fellow survivor of the teen idol machine. Ames wrote, "I'm gutted. Adam was more than a colleague. He was my only little brother, a lifelong friend." Ames, who had battled his own well-publicized demons, understood better than anyone the sheer exhaustion of Adam's fight. He knew that Adam hadn't failed. He knew that Adam had fought a war of attrition against his own biology for 40 years. In the days following his death, the narrative around Adam began to shift. The tabloids, which had spent decades mocking his mugshots, fell silent. In their place, stories from regular people began to emerge, Neighbors spoke of the guy who walked his dog and waved. Fans spoke of the kindness he showed them on Twitter. The caricature of the junkie dissolved, revealing the man underneath, a person of immense gentleness who had been handed a life he never asked for and did his best to carry the weight. Adam Rich's story is often cited as a cautionary tale, a curse, but to view it that way is to strip him of his humanity. There was no curse. There was only the brutal transaction of Hollywood. We, the audience, demanded a perfect child. We demanded Nicholas Bradford be cute, innocent, and frozen in time. When Adam Rich grew up and the cuteness faded, we withdrew our love. We left a child with an adult's bank account, a lifetime of dopamine addiction from fame, and no skills to navigate the real world. We consumed his youth for our entertainment and looked away when the bill came due. Yet, Adam paid that bill. He paid it with his mental health, his physical health, and finally, his life. But he did not die in vain. By being open about his depression, by tweeting about his sobriety, by showing his scars, he helped destigmatize the struggle of mental illness. He showed that you can be America's little brother and still suffer, and that there is no shame in that suffering. We end not with the image of the police tape in Brentwood, nor with the mug shot that haunted him. We end by looking back to 1977. We see a small boy with a bowl cut, standing on a mark, surrounded by bright lights and giant cameras. He looks up at the lens, his dark eyes sparkling with mischief and a terrifyingly raw talent. He smiles, and for a moment an entire nation feels better about itself. Adam Rich gave us that moment. He gave us his childhood, and in return, the least we can do is remember him not for how he died, but for how hard he fought to live. The haircut is gone. The show is over. But the spirit of the boy who just wanted to make people happy remains, finally at rest, finally free from the role he never stopped playing.